In this class, we're going to continue our study of classical grammar. We're on lesson 6 in our textbook, and the topic is the gender of substantive nouns. It's a very short lesson, and it's actually the last lesson about characteristics of substantive nouns. So what we're going to do in this class is quickly learn this 6th lesson on the gender of substantive nouns, but we're also going to take some time to review what we've studied so far so that we can wrap up our study of substantive nouns. Before we get started with our lesson, let's take time and prepare our notes. So at the top of your page, put the name, your name, and the date. And then the name of this course is Classical Grammar. Classical Grammar. And this is lesson 6. And the topic of this lesson is the gender of substantive nouns. The gender of substantive nouns. Like I said, this lesson on genders is actually a very short and simple lesson. So before we get to that lesson, let's take some time just to go back and review what we've studied so far. Okay? So going back through our study of classical grammar, we started out in the very first lesson learning about letters. We learned that in English there are 26 letters used in the English alphabet. And for most students that would not be a big deal. Most little children know that there are 26 letters in English. They know the English alphabet song and so on. They can name all the letters. But we find that this is important when we compare English to other languages. For example, in Latin there are only 23 letters. In Greek, there are only 24 letters. And so English is different. English has 26 letters, more than Latin or Greek. We learned that these 26 letters can be divided into two different groups, two different classes. One class of letters are called vowels, and the other class are called consonants. We learned that vowels represent vocal sounds, sounds made with the voice, and that vowels can be spoken alone. They can be spoken by themselves in a syllable. In the second class of letters we learned about were consonants, and we said that consonants cannot be sounded by themselves in a syllable, but must be joined to a vowel. So we have two classes of letters, vowels and consonants. We also learned that there are some pairs of vowels that are called diphthongs, where two vowels are spoken together in one syllable. These are called diphthongs. That word diphthongs means double sound. Diphthongs. We learned that there are a couple letters like Y and W, a couple letters like Y and W, which can be used like a vowel in some words, but might be found used like a consonant in other words. We read in our lesson that Y, for example, is a consonant when it stands at the beginning of a word or syllable, but any place else it's used as a vowel. And we learned that W, after a vowel in the same syllable, is also treated like a vowel. So there are 26 letters in English. They divide into vowels and consonants, but there are a few letters that can be used like a vowel in one place and like a consonant in another place. So we need to watch out for those letters. That was the bulk of our lesson in chapter number 1. In paragraph 7, we learned this important idea of language. We learned that vowels and consonants form syllables or that they're joined together to make syllables, that syllables are joined together to make words, and that words are joined together to make sentences. And we'll see in all of our studies that one of the main things that our minds do is join simple things together to make more complex things. Join simple ideas together to make complex ideas. Join simple letters together or sounds together to make syllables. Join syllables together to make words. Join words together to make sentences. And then we go on to study how sentences are joined together to make speeches. So we see that our mind joins things together, and in language that begins with the joining together of letters into syllables, and syllables into words, and words into sentences. We say that sentences may be referred to as speech. And so speech is made up of words. And then in our second lesson, since speech is made up of words, we have to ask the question, how can we study words? How are we going to learn about words? And we're not going to learn about words by studying all of the individual words, because that would be impossible. So what we find is that words can be divided into a number of different classes. And these different classes are called the parts of speech, since words are the parts of which speech are made. The different classes of words are referred to as the parts of speech. And we learn that in English there are 10 parts of speech. And again, this is different from other languages. In Latin and Greek, there are only 8 parts of speech. But in English, we find that there are 10 parts of speech listed in our grammar book. Now, the reason why the parts of speech are important, we said that the parts of speech are important because these are classes of words. And anything that we learn about the class of words is true of all the words that are in that class. And let me repeat that because it's very important. Anything that we learn about a class of words is true of the words in that class. Anything we learn about a class of words is true about the words in that class. And so rather than try to study every single word, which would be impossible, we simply learn about the 10 different classes of words, and then we know what's most important about all of the words in each of those classes. So when we look at a word, we can determine what part of speech or what class that word belongs to, and then everything that we've learned about that part of speech we can apply to that individual word. The parts of speech were listed in our lesson in Chapter 2. We started with substantive nouns. Then we learned about noun adjectives. We learned about articles. We went on to learn about verbs and participles. We learned about adverbs. On to the next page here. Let's see, scroll down. We learned about pronouns. We learned about prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. So through lesson 2, we learned about 10 different parts of speech. And you should be able to name each of those 10 parts of speech, and you should be able to give a simple description of each of those parts of speech, as well as a few examples. If you can't do that, you should take some time and study until you're able to describe and give an example or two for each of the 10 parts of speech in English. We then went on to lesson 3, where we learned about the division of substantives. We learned about the different kinds of substantive nouns that exist. The first division, we said, was between common and proper nouns. common nouns, which name a class of things which are common to many different nouns, many different objects or ideas. Those are called common nouns. And then we also learned about proper nouns, nouns or names that are proper or peculiar to an individual. We learned about common nouns and proper nouns. That was the first division of nouns. We then learned a second division of nouns. We learned about abstract nouns and concrete nouns. We said an abstract substantive is the name of a quality or property conceived by the mind. An abstract substantive noun is the name of a quality or a property conceived by the mind. The word abstract means drawn away from. So there are ideas in our minds that are drawn away from material things. Abstract substantives that name a quality or a property conceived by the mind. And we talk about these quite a bit in philosophy. The last division of substantive nouns, down in paragraph 25, we learned about collective substantive. So most nouns are names of individual things, but there's another class of substantive nouns that are called collective substantives. And these are nouns that name a multitude. Nouns that name a multitude as an individual thing are called collective nouns because they're names for a collection of things. Some examples of these include herd, flock, nation, and so on. All right, so we learned about common and proper nouns. We learned about abstract and concrete nouns. We learned about collective nouns in that third lesson on the division of substantive nouns. Moving on, in lesson 4, we learned about the number of substantive nouns. We learned that there were 2 numbers for substantive nouns, singular and plural. Singular refers to one individual thing. Plural refers to a number of things. And we learned that there's a general rule for how the plural is formed in English. It's formed by adding an S to the end of the normal singular noun form. So we learned about plural nouns. We learned a general rule for making plurals in substantive nouns. And then we talked about a number of exceptions to that rule and exceptions to the exceptions and how it gets quite complicated. And we simply need to learn much of this by experience, by paying attention to how words are formed, how plurals are formed, and so on. That was lesson number 4. And then in our last lesson, lesson number 5, we talked about the cases of nouns. The cases of nouns. We said that a case can be thought of as an altered form of a noun that expresses some relation. A case can be an altered form of a noun, as we find in Latin and Greek, where the noun's form is changed to express some different idea. And we said in English, if we're talking about changing of forms, there's really only one case that changes of form. And we'll see that that's not very common in English, even though that's normal in Latin and Greek. But then we learned if we're simply talking about how relationships are expressed differently with nouns, then there are as many cases in English as there are in any other language. That is, relationships between nouns. So changing of forms is not common in English, but the same ideas that are expressed by cases in other language are the same in English. We then talked about the 3 cases in English, the nominative case, the genitive case, and the accusative case. We said the simple form of a noun, the form by which anything is named, is called the nominative case. The word nominative is derived from the Latin word nomen, which simply means name or noun. So the nominative case, which is the simple form of a noun by which a thing is named, is the first case. We then learned about the genitive case, which expresses origin or possession and is usually marked in English by an apostrophe S. We talked about that a bit. And then lastly, we learned about the accusative case. Here in paragraph 50, the accusative case, which is used to mark or express a noun that's being used as a direct object of a verb. So we learned 3 cases in English, and that was all for lesson 5. And that brings us to this lesson here, lesson 6, which is our current lesson and which is the last lesson on the characteristics of substantive nouns. So, lesson 6, the gender of nouns. I hope that was a helpful review of what we've studied so far. Make sure you're going back and rereading these lessons, studying these chapters, retaking old quizzes to review the work, and keep all of this fresh in mind, because as we continue in grammar, your knowledge of what we've studied so far will help you understand each new topic, and each new topic is also going to make more sense out of the past chapters that we've studied. So constantly be moving forward into new material, but also going back and reviewing old material. Let's go ahead and get started now with lesson 6 on the gender of nouns. Let's read this lesson together. Lesson 6 on the gender of nouns. All animals, and that includes human beings, all animals are either male or female. And that's simple. We all understand what that means. All animals are either male or female. In other objects, however, objects that are not animals, there is no distinction of sex. So we don't talk about male and female plants. We don't talk about male and female rocks. We only talk about male and female animals. In other objects, there is no distinction of sex. And it's this idea of sex that we refer to when we talk about genders, the gender of nouns. Things that are considered male are said to be masculine. Things that are considered to be female are said to be feminine in gender. And if there are things that are neither male nor female, we don't call them masculine or feminine, we call them neuter. Neuter, which in Latin means neither. They are neither masculine nor feminine. Our lesson says things are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. That is, neither of the two. All right, so there are 3 genders. So in English, there are 3 genders of nouns, of substantive nouns. Masculine, feminine, and neuter. And remember, neuter means neither. Neither masculine nor feminine. Masculine refers to the gender of anything that's a male, any male animal. And feminine refers to the gender of any female, anything that's female. Anything that's not male or female is said to be neuter in gender. So there are 3 genders of nouns in English: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Let's go on and keep reading in our text. Let's read note A under chapter 6. We said in that first paragraph, in paragraph 52, we said that animals are male and female, but in other objects there is no distinction of sex. And I mentioned plants and rocks and things like that. But in Note A, we learn that even though that there is no natural gender in things that are not animals, we still think of them and refer to them as if they did have gender. Our textbook says, we speak of some inanimate things, of some inanimate, that means non-living. We speak of some inanimate things as if they had a sex. In other words, we may speak of some things as if they were persons and give them a sex. We may think of things as if they were persons and give them a sex. And in language, this is called personification. Personification means to make a person out of something that actually isn't a person. Personification. We may sometimes think of things as persons, and when we think of them as persons, we then can give them a gender. But this is all in our imagination. There's no actual gender for these things. So, for example, we're given a number of examples of this. The sun. When we think about the sun, sometimes children will draw the sun, and they'll draw the sun with eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and they'll make the sun look like a person. They'll personify the sun. When you personify the sun, do you think of the sun as being a male or a female? Most of the time, we think about the sun being male. So the sun takes on a masculine gender. We say the sun is masculine. Then, if we draw the moon, we think about the moon, and do we think about the moon as a male or a female? Normally, children and adults together think of the moon as if the moon was a female. We imagine the sun to be a male and the moon to be a female. And so we say the sun is masculine and the moon is feminine. In other languages, the words actually have these genders. Sol in Latin is masculine. Luna in Latin, which means moon, is feminine. Time and death are considered masculine. If an artist creates a picture or image of death, usually death is presented as a man coming to take a soul away. Death is presented as a man. Time is presented as being masculine. We refer to time as Father Time. Father Time. Time and death are considered masculine. Religion, virtue, and all particular virtues are usually considered to be feminine when they're personified, when they're thought of as persons. So if an artist wants to create a painting and he wants to paint an image of virtue, he'll usually paint her as a woman. The earth is usually thought of as being feminine. You know the phrase Mother Earth. We may think of the earth as being a mother who provides for her children. We think of the earth as feminine. The spring may be considered feminine. The season of spring may be considered feminine because it's a time when things begin to grow and reproduce and there's new life and birth, which is the work of a mother. Think about how Easter is celebrated in the spring and the symbols we use to celebrate Easter. We use eggs, baby chicks, and rabbits. The reason we use rabbits as a symbol of Easter is because rabbits are very, very fruitful. They produce lots of rabbits. They're a symbol of fertility. And all of these symbols of Easter and the spring that we use to celebrate the holidays, they symbolize motherhood and reproduction, fertility, and therefore spring is considered feminine. Whereas the other seasons, summer, fall, and winter, are often thought of as being masculine. Old man winter is often described in literature. Old man winter. A ship, a state, a city, a country, a law, the mind, health, and so on are often considered to be feminine things. When King Solomon wished to talk about wisdom in the book of Proverbs, he presents her in the form of a woman. He personifies wisdom and makes wisdom to be a woman, a beautiful woman. These things are represented and thought of as being feminine. And so we see that even though these things have no real gender, even though these are inanimate things that have no real gender, nevertheless, when we think about them, especially in art and poetry, we tend to personify them. And when we personify them, we often give them a gender. And so inanimate things can have gender. Substantive nouns that are not animals can have gender, not because they actually have gender, not because they actually have some sex, but because we give to them some idea of sex or gender as we personify them and think about them in different ways. Okay? So that's another way we use gender. We use gender when we think about things in an imaginative way as persons, even though naturally they are not persons. Then down to note B in our lesson. When we are speaking of any animal in a general way, and make sure you focus on that phrase, in a general way. When we're speaking of any animal in a general way, we often use a particular sex, making the more fierce, robust, and vigorous animals, bigger, nastier, stronger animals, we consider them to be masculine. And more timid, quiet, and demure, the more gentle and tame animals we consider to be feminine. And again, this is speaking in a general way. So for example, I tend to think sometimes that dogs are masculine and cats are feminine. When I think of a cat, I usually think of a feminine animal. I think of a cat laying on in a pretty living room, and you have this image of a feminine cat. Whereas when I think of a dog, I think of sports and of running and chasing animals and hunting, and I think of a masculine animal. So when we think of animals in a general way, sometimes we think of one animal as being of a certain sex, even though animals can obviously be either masculine or feminine. But it's when we think of animals in a general way, based on the characteristic of a species of animals, like a lion. We may think of a lion and think of masculine, even though there are female lions. We may still think of the image of the male lion when we think about a lion. If we think about birds, we may tend to think about some birds, maybe some sparrows or cardinals, we may think of them as being feminine because they're pretty and they sing and they're gentle. But then we may think of an eagle or a hawk, some kind of predator. We may think of those birds as masculine birds. And it's just a way of thinking. It's not true. It's not their real natural gender. It's just a way that we think about different animals when we think about them in a general way. All right, so lesson 6, like I said, is a very short lesson, a very simple lesson, and we learn about the gender of nouns. We learn that in language there are three basic genders of nouns: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Masculine gender normally refers to male animals. Feminine gender normally refers to female animals. And neuter refers to things that are neither male nor female. We also learned that sometimes we think of things in imaginative ways, and we can think of inanimate or non-living things as if they're persons. And I said this is called personification. And when we personify things, and we learned a bunch of examples in our book, when we personify things, we normally assign to them some gender. Okay, and again, we looked at a bunch of examples, and you understand this because if you've watched cartoons or look at Aesop's fables, you see this idea of personification and how it creates an idea of gender in things that don't necessarily have any gender. Okay, and that's all for lesson 6. That's all for our lesson on the gender of nouns, and that brings us to an end of our study of the characteristics of substantive nouns, which are the first of the parts of speech in English. All right? Now, before we wrap up, I'd like you to take a few minutes and write a brief summary of everything we've studied in this class. Think through what we've studied, look back over the notes you took so far, and write yourself a brief summary of what we studied in this class. Remember that these brief summaries are for your sake. So in the future, if you open up your binder or take out a folder and you've got all your notes in that folder and you're trying to find a certain thing or you're trying to remember what you studied in a certain class, you can look to that summary that you wrote at the end of your notes and remind yourself of that class. Okay, so those summaries are for your sake. If you're lazy and don't write the summary carefully, you're only going to hurt yourself. If you take a little bit of extra effort and write the summary carefully, you're going to benefit from it. So take a few minutes now and write a summary of what we covered in this class, and that's going to be all for lesson 6 in classical grammar on the gender of nouns.